Diana Lennon is here, and she will be introducing our first guest speaker this afternoon.
Thank you, Giovanna. Damon Santola is a professor in the Annenberg School for Communication, the School of Arts and Sciences, and the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is also director of the Network Dynamics Group and senior fellow at the Leonard David Institute of Health Economics. His research addresses social networks and behavior change. His work has been published across several disciplines in journals such as Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, American Journal of Sociology, and Journal of Statistical Physics. He was a developer of the NetLogo agent-based modeling environment and was awarded a US patent for inventing a method to promote diffusion in online networks. He is a member of the Sci-Fu community and fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. Before teaching at Penn, Santola was an assistant professor at MIT and a Robert Wood Johnson Fellow at Harvard University. His speaking and consulting clients include Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Cigna, the Smithsonian Institution, the American Heart Association, the National Academies, the U.S. Army, and the NBA, and now WLA. Thank you and welcome, Damon.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to share this work with you today. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, if that's okay. Let's see. Perfect. Okay. Let's do this. Hi, everyone. I wanted to share with you a few ideas today from my new book, Change, How to Make Big Things Happen. And this book is really about the new science of how we understand social change happening and really how it overturns most of what we've thought for the last century. It's been a remarkable decade for understanding the dynamics of social behavior and really the dynamics of social movements, political polarization, and initiatives for spreading new technologies and new ideas. And my interest in this area really started when I was a child. I grew up in a community of artists and social activists, and I really was always excited and interested in these sort of social change activities. But it wasn't until I got a little older and I started studying the sciences that I really started to appreciate the excitement of all the new interdisciplinary fields and the ways in which they could be combined to study society and social change in a rigorous scientific way. And so my PhD, I combined sociology with physics and studied the network dynamics of change. And that was really the beginning, in many ways, of this work and the sort of ideas that have matured in this book. And the sort of way I want to get us sort of into thinking about these topics is really what's front and center for most of us, which is trying to understand all of the changes in our world in the last year. And what's interesting is that all of these changes, which are, some of them are great, like the emergence of Black Lives Matter, and some of them are, really challenging, like the, emergence of increasing polarization, the attack on the Capitol, and of course the pandemic. And they're all interrelated, and understanding that and how that actually works and what we can do about it seems overwhelming. But this is where, our new science actually helps us a lot. One of the big questions, just to understand from the get-go, is how did COVID-19 emerge, in Wuhan, China, and then spread so effectively around the world? And then how is it that, that disease could spread really effectively across national boundaries and across political boundaries and social boundaries, with complete ease? But disease prevention measures like face masks didn't. They actually saw, complete, clustering and social balkanization, depending on, which political party you belong to or which social economic group you were in. And so the spread of something like face masks really was distinctly different from the spread of something like COVID-19. And we're seeing this again with vaccination, that, it's sort of grouped by all of these sort of social markers that have nothing to do with diffusion itself, but fundamentally control the dynamics of these behaviors. Um, and outside of the realm of the pandemic, of course, we have the sort of increasing problem of polarization, all of the resulting activism we've seen. And getting a grip on it is really difficult normally, and has been historically. But we really do have an amazing new science that's matured in the last decade for understanding these kinds of social changes and really starting to think about how we might want to intervene to address them. And one of the big sort of shifts in thinking that's happened over the last like 10 to 20 years is that instead of studying people as individuals, we started studying people as collectives, which is to say, if you look at the school of fish and you observe their, collective behavior, you can imagine studying each of these fish individually, one at a time, scanning their brains. And then the question would be, if you knew all the perfect physiological and neurological data about each of these fish, could you ever predict that when you put them all together, they would produce this sort of magnificent, complex, and adaptive behavior? Could you figure out what to do to intervene to increase the behavior, what to do to disrupt it? And the answer, of course, is no. To understand this collective process that happens when the fish are together, you need to study this collective process as a whole. And that's really what the new science is about. We've never really been able to study these collective processes among humans as a phenomenon that's a single, population behavior. We've always studied people one at a time. But what's really given rise to this sort of change in our scientific understanding and now in our understanding about social policy is the ability to study social networks in a very rigorous way. And so when we look at a large population, this can be, communities, neighborhoods. Offline, this obviously can be social interactions through social media. Online, what we notice is there are just sort of distinct locations in these networks. There are people who are in the center and they're highly connected. They have ties radiating out to lots of different parts of the social network. And then there are people who are sort of more like in the periphery or the margins of the network. They have a modest number of connections. And those connections tend to be sort of clustered together, so their friends of friends all know each other. And the way we often talk about it is that the people who are highly connected have lots of weak ties, sort of jumping all over the network, whereas the people out in the periphery have lots of strong ties, people who know each other well and close relations. And so when we think about, a social spreading process, we have some pretty clear intuitions. These intuitions really date back to some foundational work that was done in the 1940s by some sociologists, Katz and Lazarsfeld. They really kind of founded this area of studying who is influential and how that influence spreads. And one of the key ideas that was developed was that the idea of the opinion leader, which now we refer to as the influencer, which is the idea that if there's someone who's sort of highly connected in a population, once that person gets hold of an idea, that person can then influence a lot of people to sort of take that idea up. And then once it starts to spread through that sort of radiating network, then it sort of cascades outward from the center of the network towards the margins and sort of gets more and more support throughout the population. So this is the classic model of diffusion. This is the model we use for viral marketing, for innovation diffusion, for political campaigns, and for, as you've seen with vaccination recently, the whole idea of using influencers to promote vaccination. This is the sort of the model of social influence and social spreading that really we've had for nearly a century. Here's the thing, is that just in the last, like I said, decade or 15 years, we've been able to finally get really good data that allows us to critically evaluate how social change processes spread. And so looking here at the spread of Arab Spring, we see that when we look at the structure of the network, the early sort of innovators who got the sort of uprisings off the ground actually started their activist movements in the periphery of the network. And then what happens next is pretty interesting. Instead of jumping to the center and taking over, the mobilization really started to spread around the periphery among sort of modestly connected, socially clustered people. And again, instead of jumping from there to the center of the network, it kept spreading around the periphery of the network and really gained steam until it reached a critical mass that then took over the rest of the population. And so what's striking about this is it really tells two different stories. On the left-hand side, you have the classical story from like the theory of innovation diffusion, that social change spreads from the center outward. Um, and then you have the data on the right, which tells a very different story, which is that social change, innovations, and new ideas really spread from the margins of the social network, take hold around the periphery, and then take over the population. In a process, they're very much just like a tipping point. And so these are two different stories, and they're importantly different because they give us very different methods of, first of all, studying social change, but also implementing social change. It tells us, that if you want to get people to adopt vaccination, the way to do it isn't by targeting influencers, it's actually by going to like local neighborhood networks. And that's a very different strategy than what we're doing now. That when we look at these two networks, I could say, well, where do you want to put your change agent in the social network? Here are two locations. And you could say, well, the person who's highly connected in the center of the network on the left, obviously, if I put my change agent close to them, they can activate the person in the center, and you get like, massive exposure for your new idea, and everyone winds up adopting it. And that's the classic model. And what I want to suggest, and what this talk is about, and much of this sort of discussion in the book is about, is that actually every single important change event that's happened, in the last 100 years has happened in networks that look like the one on the right. That's really where change takes hold. And that violates our intuition. The network on the left looks like speed incarnate, but that only works for things like diseases, for COVID-19. But when it comes to social change, real behavior change, and, choices that are difficult and costly, it's the networks on the right that actually get the work done of spreading change and growing really a critical mass. And so really the question here is, what goes wrong? Why do we make this mistake? What's the cognitive error here? And the fundamental issue is that we base almost all of our thinking on the notion of viruses, that we've got this epidemiological model in our heads of, everything is contagious and everything spreads from person to person. And that gives us a model that, look, if someone's highly connected, that means they can infect a lot of people. And that's certainly true for COVID-19. The question is, does that translate into social change? And the social change can mean people adopting new technological innovations, people moving to different neighborhoods, or people, actually signing up for mobilization protests and, putting their feet behind their social causes. For all of these different kinds of questions, social thinking behaves differently than viruses. So I'm going to start by talking about really the viral intuition and how it fails. And the key concept here, the thing I really want you to go home with today, is the distinction between a simple contagion and a complex contagion. That winds up being very much the big idea. And then that gives rise to sort of understanding that most of our intuitions about, how things spread really are myths. And I talk about those myths, in the context of specific cases that we've seen, in the last few decades. And then I bring this sort of home to the question of like, all right, what do we do with behavior change and how do we trigger tipping points? And fundamentally, nudges can be helpful, on an individual basis. But again, like the fish schooling, our goal isn't to change people one at a time. Our goal is to change sort of the collective behavior of people. And that's really more of a focus on social norms. And so I'll talk about contagiousness, simple and complex, then the myth of virality, the myth of stickiness, and the myth of the influencer. So when we talk about contagiousness, it's helpful to sort of, frame this in terms of, again, one of the central questions that I started out with, which is, why did the novel coronavirus spread so effectively across all these different, social boundaries, whereas face masks didn't? What's the fundamental difference between these two different kinds of contagions? So let's start with simple contagions. So simple contagions are, the classic model of contagion. This is measles, HIV, COVID-19, influenza, and so forth. And the basic idea is there's someone in your network who gets infected, and you have sort of contact with them, and then they infect you. And then as a result of that, everyone you have contact with also gets infected. Now that seems really obvious, right? Much like the two tables. It seems like that's how things spread, right? Well, there's a set of assumptions that are made here that are actually really crucial for the science of understanding spreading. And the one thing is that this assumes that contact equals transmission, that basically coming into contact with someone who's infected, in their sort of relevant way, is equivalent to the disease or the infection or the idea or the piece of gossip being transmitted. And again, for a simple contagion, that's true. It's true for COVID-19. It's true for a piece of gossip, and it's true for a familiar or easy to understand product. Um, but what if we talk about new technologies that are costly or behaviors that are socially risky, like wearing face masks when no one else is wearing face masks, or that are personally or biologically risky, like getting a vaccination or joining a social movement. Um, we can start the same way we started before. You've got a person in the center, and she has a friend who's advocating for this new behavior idea. But the thing to notice is that this person also has a number of social contacts who aren't adopting, which is to say, she has a bunch of non-adopters in her network. And what you can see is that for the case of spreading COVID-19, it doesn't matter how many healthy people you know. All that matters is that contact with a sick person. So all those non-adopters or non-infected people are irrelevant. But for a complex contagion, like changing a behavior that goes against people's existing social norms, or starting to wear a face mask when no one else in your neighborhood is wearing a face mask, then all of those non-adopters are actually relevant and important signals. They're countervailing influences. So everyone you see who's not wearing a face mask, all your friends and neighbors, can help to sort of constrain your behavior and encourage you not to adopt a face mask just yet, because it's going to feel uncomfortable if no one else is doing it. Now, a second person in your neighborhood may adopt, and it may give you sort of more evidence that this is the right thing to do. And then finally, after a third person adopts, you start to feel like, okay, this is the norm. We're all wearing face masks now, and now you wear a face mask. And the point here is that when it comes to changing behaviors, when it comes to sort of spreading complex contagions, people require sort of contact with multiple people, but more than that, they need enough social reinforcement to overcome the resistance, the implicit resistance that comes from seeing people who aren't adopting those behaviors. And this is true for anything that's difficult or unfamiliar or costly. And once we appreciate this difference between simple contagion and complex contagion, this is what really kind of exposes or reveals the sort of essential myths of diffusion. And the biggest one is the myth of virality, which is that everything spreads like a virus. The second one is this notion of stickiness, which is that if your product or innovation is just better or more memorable or has certain properties, then it will spread and be successful. And the third one, and probably the most consequential one for the kinds of policy initiatives and change campaigns we'd like to see, is that influencers are the way to spread things. It's the myth of the influencer. And really, that idea depends on the other two. It's sort of the big culminating idea, which is why it's been so influential, and also why it's so very wrong and problematic when it comes to changing people's behaviors, like vaccination. So let's start with the myth of virality. The idea that ideas, behaviors, new products spread like a virus was formalized by Gladwell in this book, but it's more just an elegant articulation of an idea that's been around since the 1940s, the way that we've talked about spreading almost always, since this science began, has relied on this sort of common intuition that we're looking at is something that's more or less like a virus. And what we have now is really good data from some really interesting studies that tried to use these ideas to spread social change. So in the 1960s, a lot of nations were going through what's called the demographic transition. And this is basically agrarian societies becoming modernized. And what happened in the 60s was an unusual moment in sort of the history of the world, because previously, when a country was, modernizing or industrializing, you'd have like 50, 60, 70 years to transition and the adoption of these new technologies, because the technologies, like in the case of Europe and the US, the technologies were being developed, and industrialization was being developed, and vaccines were being developed, and sanitation and public water was being developed. All these new technologies were sort of coming online as nations were adopting them, which means there was a slow process of innovation and cultural change, that by the time these technologies were mature and you had sort of mass distribution of vaccination, you had mass acceleration of food supply, industrialization and production, all of that was basically designed to fit into societies that had changed their notion of family planning and their notion of child rearing, or knows their expectations for human capital investments in children and so forth. Um, in the 1960s, nations like Pakistan, Indonesia, and Korea didn't have that kind of time. They were basically being bombarded by this flood of technological innovation. Um, all at once, they got sanitation, vaccination, increased food supply, and so forth. And although those things all seem like goods in the sense that, like, what nation wouldn't want that? The problem was that families still were maintaining, standard agrarian family planning practices, which is to say having 5 to 6 children per family with the expectation of high infant mortality. But with the influx of all of these new technological and modern advantages, infant mortality dropped. And so you wound up having was this sort of Malthusian problem, which is just exponential population growth, generation after generation. And so it was really clear that within 2 generations, you were going to have massive, like dangerously high overpopulation, like within Korea, that would lead to, problems of, starvation and disease that would basically swamp the national economy. So there was an urgency to spreading, family planning practices that would, change the social norms. And the challenge was that, these practices are entrenched in people's lifestyles, their cultural beliefs, their sort of sense of well-being, their sense of pride and success as family members. And so, how do you change all of that on a short time scale? And what's so interesting about this story is that lots of different nations were trying to do this at the same time, and most of them used like mass media campaigns, the standard public health initiative that told everyone they need to change their behavior and give them the reasons why. And those nations largely failed to achieve their goals and suffered as a consequence. While Korea reached all of its policy goals in less than 20 years. And that's a remarkable feat. I mean, you can compare it, for example, to like the U.S.'s war on drugs, which started in the early 1970s, and by, the 2015, the U.S. had largely conceded that, like, after 40 years of work on this problem and billions of dollars spent, that the problem had just gotten worse. So, having massive culture change at a nationwide scale on such a short time scale is really impressive. And so it really invites us to ask the question of what Korea did and why it succeeded. And the answer is that Korea took a focus that wasn't really on telling people what to do or on changing behavior specifically, so much as looking at the ways that social norms would take hold within people's social networks. So here are 3 different sort of ways of characterizing the villages within Korea. One is that you've got some very tightly, on the left-hand side, we call brokers, some very tightly clustered communities with maybe a single tie, a weak tie reaching across to another community. And, but largely these different communities are disconnected. And then you've got on the far right-hand side, basically an urban network, largely cosmopolitan, everyone's interacting with everyone. But in the middle, you have this case, which I refer to as wide bridges. And this is the case where you have, community clusters where people are sort of more involved with some people than they are with everybody else. But across these clusters, you've got sort of reinforcing ties that create what is, in essence, a wide bridge. So wide bridge just means multiple reinforcing social connections across different groups. Whereas in the case of the brokers, where each group is tightly clustered, the connection across groups is a single tie or a narrow bridge, right? So basically relies on that one person to communicate information across the 2 groups. So what happens when you try to initiate, a sort of contraceptive initiative in these different kinds of networks is the network on the left, you wind up getting good buy-in within the group that is trying to initiate it, and everyone adopts. But there's not enough social reinforcement to spread the idea to other people in other groups who are already, maintaining existing family planning practices, the status quo, and so they can't be convinced to change their behavior, right? So this is the question of which of these networks is really effective for spreading this complex contagion. In the urban network, you basically no buy-in whatsoever, because your sort of early adopters or your sort of change agents can't even coordinate with each other because they're just sort of interacting with lots of different people, and they're ineffective at growing any support for this change initiative, let alone, spreading it to the large, majority of the population. The special case, and the case that was discovered in Korea, the sort of the Korean village networks that were most effective in spreading the adoption of contraception, were networks that had this structure where you had, closely um, knit groups, and they were essentially women's groups within different parts of the village, and they would coordinate with each other and sort of, promote the adoption of vaccination, or sorry, the adoption of contraception, um, and then it would sort of spill over to other groups, other parts of the village, and other sort of members of the community. And it would sort of cascade from group to group to group through these reinforcing ties, ultimately generating large amounts of buy-in and fundamentally a change in the social norms within the village. And what's so interesting about this idea of looking at the sort of clusters within the village and how the interconnections between those clusters help us to understand change in norms is that this very idea translates perfectly into our understanding of organizational networks. Is that by and large, organizational networks are often structured in divisions or teams where they can be like highly siloed, these sort of divisions within an organization, and people interact heavily within their group, but not a lot across the group. And one of the sort of big insights in network theory and sociological theory in the 90s was, well, if you could find someone who would play the role of the broker and sort of bridge these ties, essentially between different groups, that person could perform this huge service for the organization, and information could now flow between these disparate groups. More importantly, now talking in a sort of organizational context, this person who can perform this broker role actually gains a lot of individual advantage. They get known as someone who has lots of information about what's going on in the organization. They're known as someone who's good at spreading things across different places, and they also get tapped on the shoulder by more people and people higher up, because they're the person who gets to be known for being in the know and sort of in the mix in terms of what's happening in all different parts of the firm. So all of this seems good, which is to say, not only does it perform an organizational benefit, but this idea of creating these sort of narrow bridges or these sort of links across the network performs, creates benefits for the broker as well as for the organization. But here's the thing. That's true if what we're looking at is the spread of information in the sense of a simple contagion. But what if Robert wants to institute a change in the culture of the organization, a change in the social norms of how people are acting? Let's say the gender culture within the organization, norms and expectations about equal pay, norms and expectations about sexual harassment. How does that spread? Is a single tie across these different groups enough to convey the value and the practices that are sort of being advocated here, and whether or not they'll be successful and adopted as they spread from group to group? And the thing is that if people in group A hear from Robert of this initiative, that's fine, now they know about it. But in order to change their behavior, to be convinced that this is a new and legitimate behavior, they have to see other people engaged in the behavior. They have to feel comfortable that this is actually an expectation of them, and also that they understand what that means for their daily practice and their sort of routines. So imagine now the networks look like this. So we've changed the narrow tie, the narrow bridge, from A to B into a wide bridge. Now we have multiple reinforcing connections. This does a tremendous amount of work in terms of accelerating the diffusion of innovation and cultural change. All of a sudden, people in Group A have multiple ties than people in Group B. They can see people in Group B adopting this new behavior and how the people in Group B coordinate with each other. More importantly, people in Group A can now talk to each other about their observations and coordinate with one another about getting the rest of the people in Group A to adopt this new norm or convention. And so what this means is, while the idea of brokers and the idea of narrow bridges across an organization is useful for thinking about the spread of information, it's not really useful for thinking about the spread of innovations, which require these wide bridges to create trust, confidence, and fundamentally a sense of legitimacy in this new organizational change. And in the book, I described this not just in the context of a single organization, but also in networks that form across organizations, whether brokerage networks are effective for not just spreading information, but whether they can help organizations to share ideas and to coordinate and collaborate within industries, And one of the big lessons from open innovation in Silicon Valley is that the successful firms created these wide bridges of like deep overlapping engagement that created trust and coordination across, organizational boundaries. So what this tells us overall is that there's this sort of deep lesson about the structure of wide bridges and what this means for the capacity for innovation and social change. And now what we want to ask is, okay, well, what can we do with that? As an innovator, how would I use that structure to make change? And so this is where we kind of transition from looking at the different kinds of structures you find within village networks, the different kinds of structures you find within organizations, to saying, okay, if there's a given structure, how would I go about targeting it? So if I thought that the contagion was a viral contagion, a simple contagion, I would pretty much target a network the way on the left. I would find, all the different groups and clusters, and I'd put a change agent in every single cluster, right? I get maximum exposure for this idea, and that's viral thinking. But here's the thing, if this change is a new idea, it's uncomfortable, unfamiliar, it's not very well accepted, it's not going to be perceived as legitimate. So even though each of these people is doing it, they're also doing it alone as far as anyone else knows. Everyone around them in their social network basically is ignoring them. So what winds up happening is that they're not effective at all for initiating change because they don't have any support. And ultimately, these people, surrounded by everyone maintaining the status quo, will probably give up the change initiative and go back to the status quo as well. You can only sort of stand out and be a deviant for so long before you kind of are brought back into the fold. But what happens if we take the same number of change agents and now do something kind of counterintuitive? We cluster them together within sort of one part of the social network. Now, from the perspective of viral marketing or viral diffusion, that's a sort of a crazy idea because essentially you're sort of reducing the impact of your resources. You're limiting their exposure to the network, and essentially you're having them connected to each other. This would be like having a bunch of telemarketers call one another. What would be the point? We're all telemarketers. The point here is that because your change agents are connected to each other, they can talk to each other about the change initiative. And this is, of course, the way in which the Korean villages were successful is you had new people who are adopting the contraceptive norm, coordinating with each other. They could talk about it with one another, support each other's decision to adopt contraception, discuss their sort of concerns and some of the challenges with using it month to month. And then they can coordinate with each other to influence other people who could observe them having this conversation, which created sort of social currency within this group. And then once that happened, then just like I showed you before, this would spill over to the next group and then spill over to other groups. So the same sort of social reinforcement process across wide bridges. And this gives us a very good understanding about how social and cultural change happens, both within sort of, really, endogenous networks that take hold in villages and in other cases in neighborhoods, but also within organizational networks where we can sort of help to manufacture sort of connectedness through wide bridges, and then we can help to target and initiate change initiatives within those organizations. One of the most interesting lessons from the spread of contraception in Korea is that this spreading process, which happened exactly the way that you see in these sorts of models of diffusion, grew through this sort of overlapping networks across women's groups and generated, complete agreement on the method of contraception that was adopted in the village. And this really sort of brings us to the punchline of the next myth, which is the myth of stickiness. And the myth of stickiness is that there are certain features of a product that make it inherently more attractive, more likely to spread. It's emotional, it's got certain triggers, it's public, it's practical, it's got social currency, it's fun to talk about, it's memorable, and so forth. I mean, we've all heard these ideas, but we've got case after case after case from the history of product development and the history of economics that show all these market examples of inferior products that were poorly marketed that shouldn't have won, but yet did win. And what happens in every one of these cases is that although there's a sort of superior product that's better marketed, that seems like the right technology, it loses because it didn't exploit social networks in the right way. And the inferior option wins because it got a hold of the social network in the very same way that we were looking at in Korea. and then was able to sort of manufacture social reinforcement that caused that option to then take hold. And so this seems like an interesting sort of take-home lesson from the history of product adoption, but it actually has huge and important implications for understanding some of our, contemporary and most vital social change initiatives. So one of the strategies in sub-Saharan Africa to spread HIV prevention was, for a long time, male circumcision, but this ran into enormous cultural backlash to the extent that some of the aid workers in Kenya and other countries were actually attacked because this intervention was, a profanity, both, culturally and religiously, to the locals. And so people in public health had to do sort of a very serious moment of like gut checking and try to figure out what they could do that would be effective for changing entire populations to behaviors that would be effective for preventing the spread of HIV, but at the same time not violate standard cultural norms and customs that would be much less invasive. In essence, the idea was to to develop a stickier product, and there was, in fact, a massive breakthrough called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. And you'll see this. This is currently, being advertised and spread in U.S. cities now as well. And there was this huge study across, 3 different sub-Saharan nations, and it was a large, one of the largest invested studies by the National Institutes of Health to address this challenge of HIV pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And what they did was exactly what the kind of stickiness playbook told them to do, which is they developed a technology that was free, it was accessible, it was essentially one daily Tylenol, and it was 90% effective. So basically, you take a Tylenol a day, and then you can have sex without a condom and very low likelihood of having any HIV transmission. It seems like a win for everyone. Plus, they created outreach centers all around each of these communities and each of these nations, and made sure everyone knew about it. Huge information diffusion campaigns and huge like public policy and governmental efforts to promote the use of this. And then they even created a study where they brought village members in from different nations to be part of this weekly check-in to make sure that they were adopting it, and they would check their blood levels and everything to make sure they were still healthy. And what wound up happening was nothing short of a fiasco, which is that the people who were actually in the trials, who were coming every week to be convinced to take the medication, they would pick up the medication and go home and get their payment. I mean, these are people who aren't just ignoring this innovation; they're actually part of the study community. When their blood levels were measured, fewer than 30% of those women who are part of the study actually had PrEP in their bloodstream. So this is mind-boggling. And there was actually a paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine that spent a lot of time basically doing hand-wringing over the fact that so much time, so much effort, and so much money had been spent with this intervention as like, the kind of golden demonstration of the value of this strategy. And it failed more colossally than anyone could have anticipated. And what wound up happening was that even though the product was sticky and the message was clear and the message was sticky and so on and so forth, there were social norms in the community that prevented people from adopting. First of all, people had the fear that taking the pill to prevent HIV would actually give them HIV. Now, that sounds crazy at first, but then there's a large number of people who think that getting a flu vaccine will give them the flu in the US. It's just a common misconception. But then there was also very strong discrimination norms against people who had HIV. So these two fears, right, combine so that people are fear that if they get, HIV from the pill, that they would then have to deal with all the norms of discrimination. Or if their neighbors know that they're taking the pill and their neighbors suspect that the pill can cause HIV, then even if they know it's not true, they have to worry about their neighbors' worries that maybe by virtue of taking this preventative medication, they're actually perceived of as someone who has higher risk, right? And so the social norms and the misconceptions that are reinforcing within that culture wind up being far more influential on people's behaviors than the cleverness of the innovation, the catchiness of the advertising, or the use of influencers. And so the point here is that in order to sort of understand social change, we fundamentally have to understand the social norms that frame people's receptiveness or resistance to a new idea. So let's talk about this, the myth of the influencer. So when we look at this kind of network and we see that, right, the people in the center who are highly connected and the people on the periphery who have modest connections, we tend to have this like very clear idea, which is there's two things about the influencer or the highly connected person that makes them effective. One is they very easily can detect a new idea in the world. So if we imagine the person on the left at the center of this network is a Fortune 500 CEO, and she can find very early on new ideas, new technologies to adopt, new management strategies, and new office technologies for increasing productivity. So she's exposed to an idea like this, and we say, oh, right, because she's exposed to it, she can adopt it, right? And then she can tell everyone else. And that seems to sort of resonate with all of our intuitions. It's certainly how viral contagion works, right? It's a person who's highly connected is going to come in contact with a virus before other people because they have so many connections. Once they get sick, they can infect a lot of people. This is our notion of super spreaders. And we tend to generalize this to everything from, Fortune 500 firms adopting new management practices to the spread of technologies like Twitter to the growth of movements like Black Lives Matter, right? But here's the difference between a viral contagion and a social contagion. When a contagion is complex, that person in the middle, sure, they're going to discover the idea early on, and a Fortune 500 CEO will probably discover, a new technology or new management strategy before, let's say, someone on the right, like a small startup CEO. But here's the thing, is that person, because they have so many social contacts, also knows they have a lot of people watching them, a lot of people evaluating what they do, criticizing and commenting on what they do. So they're actually highly socially constrained by their wealth of social contacts. And they also know that if they adopt this thing early on and it goes south on them, that actually they take a huge hit, reputationally. Whereas the person on the right-hand network, they have a modest number of contacts. It only takes a few adopters to convince them that this thing is actually a reasonable thing to do. They don't have as many countervailing influences surrounding them. And then if they do adopt, then they can convince some of their friends and neighbors to adopt, and they can sort of generate a reinforcing cluster of support. And actually, that reinforcing cluster of support winds up being way more powerful early on for generating the growth that gets a critical mass. And it's the critical mass that ultimately gets the influencer to pay attention. The secret to change isn't about forcing it on a population through, high profile people. It's about growing it within a population so that the norms actually become the sort of the root point for changing social behavior. And so we can hold the case of like the HIV program failure and the glass failure as cases that kind of slammed into social norms, with the Korean contraception case, which is a case that actually harnessed social norms and grew change effectively. And we see this actually in lots and lots of cases that, back since the 1970s, there's been example after example, both offline diffusion, institutional change, online diffusion, Arab Spring. We just have, the better our data get, the more examples we have of social change not spreading from highly connected people at the center of the network, but actually taking hold in the margins of the network and spreading from there. And so what this gives rise to ultimately is the fundamental question, and this is where I'm going to sort of end the talk, is with whom do we target, which is to say, what do we do with the science now that we understand that what we've thought for so long is wrong? How do we take action? So many of the sort of scholars in this area think, well, okay, it's maybe hard to activate a social star, but what if we could do it? This is, of course, what gets us into the kind of Google Glass problem. And the assumption for most people is that, well, whatever's going to spread, it's going to spread, like a viral contagion, a social, like a viral video or a social meme or something. And so if we can just get a highly connected person to adopt it, it'll spread throughout the network. The challenge for that point of view, right, is that that notion relies on the idea that there are certain special people who can basically push their will onto everybody else. And again, for simple things that can be effective. But now what if we're talking about social change where people are, entrenched in the status quo they actually like the social norms they're part of, or at least they're used to coordinating with the people around them. So they can't just unilaterally change behavior like you can if watching a viral video. There's not a lot of countervailing pressure. You can just watch it. But when it comes to changing behavior or supporting a social movement like Black Lives Matter, or shifting, public acknowledgement of a social movement, like changing your Facebook profile to support same-sex marriage, these are cases where you actually are paying attention to the other people around you and their social risk with adopting a change. And in cases like this, just because an influencer adopts doesn't mean anyone else is going to adopt, because influencers have countervailing influences and everyone around the influencer also has countervailing influences. And so there's not much efficacy there. But what if we can identify places in the network out here in the periphery where we can have reinforcing clusters of people who can adopt together and then trigger sort of this cascade process through wide bridges out in the periphery of the network. And what's so interesting about this process is that when it takes hold and succeeds, it doesn't just spread everywhere at once. It actually spreads in a kind of a deliberate way through very specific pathways around the periphery of the network till it reaches a critical mass, and then it cascades through the center and around the population. And in the book, I talk about what this means for the spread of Black Lives Matter. I talk about the growth of support for marriage equality. I talk about the success of Twitter, also for the growth of solar panels. Spread of changes in norms in medicine to address gender and race bias. It's also true for addressing challenges to political discourse and democracy, basically initiatives that my work and my team have designed to reduce political polarization through creating social network constructs online that allow people to learn from each other instead of to engage in what would essentially heated political discourse. We've also used the same analysis to understand the growth of the Me Too movement, and fundamentally, to bring it back to our essential question about, face masks and vaccination, these same strategies are now being used to sort of implement new vaccination campaigns. And so what this means overall is that when it comes to our core intuitions, right, about spreading, when I say what's the difference between COVID-19 and face masks, hopefully you actually can start to see the world differently now. You can see that COVID-19 is going to spread really effectively in the network on the left. But if you want to spread face masks, it's the network on the right that's going to do the trick. And the punchline here is for any new behavior that's costly or difficult or unfamiliar, social reinforcement typically requires the sort of the networks that create channels of wide bridges across different communities. And this really changes us from thinking about nudges to sort of change one person's behavior at a time to norms. We can spread change across entire populations, and fundamentally gives us a vision for social capital. That very much like financial or human capital, we can actually create social capital in these sort of structures online and offline that help to grow change and ultimately create the change that we want to see. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking your questions.
All right, thank you. So just like before, we're going to do questions. Either submit them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand. Any of the above. I see something, Allison. Is that applause? I think we've got some clapping. So feel free to use the reaction to clap as well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll start off with a question kind of about some of the, I've been reading some things recently about, I guess it would fall under social risk that you talked about, and the idea of kind of like, either sharing fake news to kind of fulfill this feeling of belonging within a group, or ignoring certain things to to avoid distancing yourself from a group. I guess this is also like people talk about people getting into their like little rabbit holes and all sorts of stuff through social media. So I'm wondering, in the past couple of years, where conspiracy theories have really been kind of I don't know if they're more prevalent now or just getting a lot more surface exposure, and they're working very much antagonistically to other efforts around public health. Is there anything like a best practice or a best approach that has come out of your work, or anything that you could advise on for that?
Yeah, I discussed some of these issues with conspiracy theories in the book, and in those cases, I'm addressing some of the things that have happened in China with regard to the government suppression of opposition using techniques that are akin to like witch hunts, which are generally conspiracy theories. And I've written about how this then translates into things like QAnon. And what's, I think, informative about a lot of this work on social networks is that to understand how these sort of conspiracies grow, how they take hold, and fundamentally how they spread, we really do have to understand who's talking to whom, because it's true that there have always been, pockets of conspiracy theories, but we're seeing them reach larger numbers of people than before. And I think that's what's sort of catching our attention. And so there is fundamentally a spreading process underway, and it behooves us to understand what that is. There are new social media environments, like I'm sure we're all familiar with Parler, that emerged as a sort of a vehicle for creating coordination and sort of essentially for wide bridges across different communities that could generate a sort of synergistic interpretation of historical events and of current political events in a way that would generate kind of consensus. And what's interesting about that is that there are ways that we now know because of network theory to disrupt those kinds of networks to prevent that kind of social coordination from succeeding. But here the question becomes really subtle. I mean, it becomes actually a question of ethics, which is that what would it have meant for our society if these same strategies that I talk about in the book had been advertised 2 years earlier during the Trump administration, and Trump had felt that Black Lives Matter, let's say, was equally a threat to the integrity of the US? Then these network strategies could have been deployed on social media to disrupt the social networks that were fundamentally at work in the organization of Black Lives Matter. And so it really raises a big question about how social policy is supposed to operate in a world where we actually understand with a level of precision and control that we never have before, how those mobilization networks operate, and in a domain where we actually have some sort of authority or control, like social media, where companies can make decisions and then governments can mandate or regulate company behavior. We saw that Amazon kicked Parler off of its web services, right? And that was a company making a decision. We also saw that Twitter censored the president, right? And that was also a company decision. And this has raised in our day and age this enormous question, which again, it's a policy question. It's a science question in the sense that there is, in fact, a body of science that understands and explains what the effects of this are. But it's fundamentally an ethical question, which is, if we make these decisions or allow companies to make these decisions rather than governments, which represent the people, then there's some way in which those decisions, although they're motivated in some sense by an obligation to the public good, can also be responsive to market pressures, right? And this is a big concern. Whenever markets self-regulate, even with the best of intentions, it tends to go in a bad direction. So Enron is one of the sort of biggest case studies of self-regulating markets, which turned into sort of just mass corruption and exploitation. And it's not to say that that's necessarily where social media will go, but I think that in anticipating the ways in which the formation of networks online can allow groups like Parler to become established, which can allow the growth of conspiracy theories that then amplify anti-democratic and in many senses, racist and hate speech-based activism. One thing we need to consider is, to what extent can governments intervene without fundamentally undercutting the sort of the ability of other groups that may mobilize in future cases against our government or other governments from being stopped just because what they're saying isn't particularly attractive to the government, right? So this is a very fine ethical line, and I'm currently working on this, and I've written on this recently. And so the answer is yes, there's some very clear science that we understand about how to disrupt those networks. And the real question is, how and when should that be deployed? And I think that that's really the subtle and most important ethical issue of the day.
Thank you. So we have another one in the chat. How successful do you think libraries have been as agents of social change?
Historically or recently? Um, I think, so first of all, I should say I am a friend to libraries. My mother is in fact a librarian. So I hold libraries in high esteem in general. And in fact, the very first talk I gave my book, just even like months before it had come out, was on this thing called the Library Journal. That was my initial talk. And that was actually one of the most interesting experiences, being on a panel with other authors speaking in the library community. So, my view is that libraries are, have been always these kind of gathering places. And, it's true for independent bookstores too, gathering places for people to become exposed to like new authors, new work, new thinking. And hopefully, as we sort of transition into a more sort of digital and virtual world, the library can still maintain that function as first a physical gathering place, but also as a sort of conceptual center for the sharing of ideas, very much like WLA is doing. And it seems like everyone's sort of hungry for that. And there are, new apps. I'm sure many of you have heard of Clubhouse, which is basically like a virtual conference center hosted on a social media app. But what's interesting about libraries is there's, this, I think, commitment to a certain set of values and a certain set of principles with regard to the just exposure to new information, but also the conversation, the discourse around it that helps to keep a community lively. And so I think from that perspective, libraries are essential. I think the role of libraries in society is something that is dynamic now much more than ever has been historically. And I think that there's also a tremendous amount of interest among the librarians I know in engaging with this and taking all of these sorts of, in fact, some of the people I know who are really on the forefront, digitally and social, technologically, in trying to think about the ways that, digital humanities or technologies can engage with social change are librarians or people with MLS or ML degrees who think about these kinds of change initiatives socially as something that libraries should be fully part of and helping to mediate public conversations on. And so I think it's an exciting time, and that libraries can play a really important role in that. I probably know less about what you are thinking about this, what Giovanna and others are thinking about this than I ought to, but I think that certainly there's several ideas probably floating around in the background even now about what this kind of convening event will look like next year, and how new ideas and technologies will be implemented then.
Okay, well, we're on that thread, kind of tangential to that. Somebody said, librarians are very good at responding to demands of information on hot topics and new issues. Love the brag. How would you recommend that we prepare more and anticipate trends that might be on the horizon? So how do we stay on top of everything?
Right, exactly. There is so much news out there, right? And so many things shifting. It's interesting, though, a colleague of mine at Annenberg did a study, a photojournalistic study, where he took, it was basically a photo essay. Part of the goal of the photo essay was to capture not just the opinions of librarians, but the sense of like, who are librarians? And what was so powerful about it is that like more than half the people had like spikes in their noses, like pink mohawks, right? It was like, it wasn't your, 1890s picture of who a librarian is, right? It's people on the cutting edge who love books, who love ideas, who love thinking, but are really culturally on the avant-garde. And so I think that these people, is the ones whom I know, are extremely engaged in thinking about ways in which digital culture is part of what libraries should and can be. So I think that there's quite a bit of thinking going on by people who are much more involved in this than I am on exactly that question, which is how to anticipate and engage with trends. And one of my colleagues has just published a new book on digital culture transformation in library settings. And so I think that the doors of the library are always open, which is one of the beautiful things about the library. And when knowledge hopefully is something more than just what's happening on social media, where it's, you know, the cultivation of the theories and ideas and the sort of, you know, conceptual background for, you know, the innovations that we see unfolding in front of us, the libraries wind up being a place where people can kind of deepen their understanding of the trends that happen to be unfolding. And the sort of, you know, the quick, simple contagions that are flying all around, libraries hopefully act as kind of a grounding resource that help to keep that conversation, I think, steeped in something that has a bit more permanence and a bit more sort of impact ultimately in how people think.
Thank you. One question from the chat, and then Elena, I see you got your hand raised. So just if you could quickly say anything about how creating a sense of exclusivity might have an impact on change, whether that's, you know, for the better or the worse. I guess the idea of being like in like a kind of inner circle of information, how that plays into adoption and things like that.
Well, exclusivity can go in different directions, right? So I talk about this in the book in the context of the example of Google Glass, right? Because Glass tried to exploit a strategy that's often been used by like top brands like Rolex and Ferrari to create a sense of exclusivity around their products, and through that to create a sense of aspiration. And the idea is that people would then, you know, gather savings or whatever, you know, resources they had to become a member of whatever club that exclusive brand delineates. And in the book, I talk about it in the context of Dr. Seuss's story of Sneetches. And everyone probably remembers the story, but like everyone had, you know, they have the star-bellied Sneetches, and they're like the high status Sneetches. And then, you know, some entrepreneur comes along and has the brilliant idea of selling stars, right? And so now he's like selling status. And so people can like get the stars, put on stars on bars, right, on their belly. But then what winds up happening, of course, is that he sort of iterates on this and then just starts to sell a star removal machine. So now removing your star is the new it thing. And so this kind of goes on and on until, you know, cleverly in a Dr. Seuss style, all social distinctions are removed because no one can tell who has a star and who doesn't, becomes irrelevant. And so, you know, this is kind of what Google Glass was about. Although they weren't trying to eliminate social distinctions, they were trying to create a new star. They basically said, well, you know, people who wear glass, it's a $1,500 piece of eyewear. It's, you know, a kind of a signal of socio-technical sophistication. And it means that you're, you know, in the know and you can do things other people can't. And the idea was to give that eyewear to a bunch of influencers, like basically, you know, sophisticated young techies in the Bay Area, and everyone was going to want to be like them. What happened in that case, however, was that very exclusivity, which works for products like Rolex and Ferrari, completely backfired for Google. In fact, it was a fiasco. Not only was the product line canceled, because what happened was that glass wound up signaling a cultural divide between the people who could afford glass and would wear glass and do things like browse the web in a face-to-face conversation, which was perceived as rude, and then use this technology as a surveillance tool in public situations, which was perceived as a violation of privacy. And so this term you guys have heard of is glass hole, which was invented at the time to describe people who would wear the product. So that's like an example of market failure, of like working so hard to create exclusivity and, you know, identify, you know, your influencers, that people started looking at them and calling them names because they were wearing your product, right? And so it kind of created a culture war, and the result was that not only was the product line canceled, but the reputation of Google actually took a hit, right? Because Google used to be this cool company that celebrated women and minorities on its search engine, and now it was like a tech juggernaut that sold surveillance technology for the rich. And so that was, you know, in many ways a result of creating, you know, exclusivity through influencers. And so exclusivity is a tricky thing when we're looking at social change, particularly in contexts where there are existing social norms, right? And so this is like one of the punchlines of the talk and of the book, is that real change has to engage with the social norms people have. And so I think of inclusiveness as like one of the better strategies for growing support.
Thank you. All right, so Elena, I think we can take your question.
Okay, it'll be quick. I might be a little bit off. I want to make sure I'm on point. First of all, thank you. This has been. I'm looking forward to the book right now. a lot of the work that we do is around information and media literacy, getting people to look critically at the information in front of them. I was just talking to a colleague about the CRAP test, content, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose, having people think about that. I feel like there's another aspect that you're raising, not just how did this information come to you? There's another, what's the trend in thinking that's creating this topic, that's putting it in front of you. There's something in your work that I think has to influence how we teach others to engage with information, with trends and ideas. Do you have any sort of thought on what, if there's one thing I would add to my acronym for how to think about the quality of the information that I am receiving and searching for?
Okay, well, I have to think for a while about the cleverness of my acronym. Whether it's like, crafty or craftiness. But
I'll work on that.
But right, you can take care of that part. But what I would say is that, yeah, this topic is close to my heart. And the last chapter in the book, chapter 12, deals explicitly with this issue. And it's basically the question of, if you give people the right information, is that enough? And, it's in the broader space of misinformation, but more specifically, there's a set of studies that we ran. These were published in the National Academy a couple of years, and I had an op-ed in Scientific American this fall that addressed specifically what happens when you put Democrats, Republicans together and give them not just ideas, have a talk about climate change, but you give them the actual data from NASA and say, these are the climate change data. Now, what do we know about climate change? And what's so striking is that the Democrats and Republicans looking at the same data come to the exact opposite conclusion about what the climate trends are. And it's trivially true that if you look at the graph, there's this massive downward trend in Arctic sea ice. And it looks like Arctic sea ice is plummeting more in the last 10 years than it has in the previous 40. And so something is happening, and that is an indication of global warming. But it's noisy data. So it's, there's a massive trend, but year to year, it kind of bounces up and down. And so you can pick any one of those points that's like noisy and focus on it and say, well, but that point is showing a different trend. And this is what actually a large number of the Republicans did with the same amount of education, the same sort of intelligence, right? It's not a matter of not knowing how to read a graph. It's a matter of bias. And that bias, which we bring to the information we're exposed to, fundamentally determines what we interpret and what we see. And this is huge because there's a huge emphasis, and I'm part of this WHO task force on the infodemic around the pandemic. And everyone there, and they're all like very important, smart people, but we're all talking about, how to give people accurate information. And the challenge here is, sure, you don't want misinformation flying around or, outright lies, because that's confusing. And that also helps to amplify people's existing biases. But just giving people accurate information isn't enough to undo their biases, because bias is at work anyway. And more importantly, bias is at work in our social networks. If I see this thing and I see other people talking about it in a way that's negative or sarcastic, that frames my view of what that piece of information is actually telling me, right? And so there's all of this sort of work that networks are doing. And I talk about it this way. I say the way we think about networks typically in the disease model is that our social networks are like these pipes. They're basically these conduits for a transmission. I'm sick, and then I interact with you, and there's basically a tie that then spreads the disease to you, and you're sick, and each person you interact with. And this is when we do contact tracing to study the spread of the pandemic. We're doing this. We're treating each contact as a pipe. But the way to think about networks, and this is really one of the ideas that's central to the book, is that networks are prisms. Each of the interactions we have helps to shape and refract and color the information we see and ultimately determine whether we accept it or whether we reject it. And that's the sort of the huge thing that's going on in social networks that's entirely invisible to us. There's no way we can see that because all we see is the color. We don't see the work that the prism is doing. And so when we give people information, the question is, how do we structure their exposure socially to that information in a way that gets them to actually understand what the information is saying and what it means for them? And this is where the results from the work we did are exciting, because they show that by virtue of structuring social relationships and looking at the sort of connections through wide bridges, you can actually have a conversation among Democrats and Republicans that solves the problem, where both groups come to a better understanding of what the data are saying. In fact, both the Democrats and the Republicans reached like almost 90% accuracy finally in their interpretation of the data as a result of these networks. But this stuff is subtle. I mean, the science here is really delicate, because that works, it's replicable, we can do it again and again. But if you change one feature of the environment, we ran the exact same study, but then we put just a little logo in the corner of the screen, not associated with any person, but just a little elephant, a little donkey, just reminding everyone this was like a political discussion. And all of those social learning effects disappeared and people were completely polarized. And so these little effects, these really kind of framing effects that come from images, graphics, videos, and so forth, which of course are, social media is infused with these everywhere. They have this really powerful effect on how we perceive what other people are saying and the inferences we make based on the information we're exposed to. And so the answer, yeah, is that when we're looking at the work that information can do in terms of changing people's minds and getting them to behave differently, it can be successful. But this is the cutting edge. These papers are, in the last 2-3 years, are published in the top journals in the world, because everyone's just coming to understand exactly how this works and exactly how networks and media signals and these sorts of visual framing effects all interact to create a kind of social ecosystem that can lead to extreme polarization and fundamentally to misunderstanding. People saying, yeah, I saw those data, I got those data, they say what I believe. Yeah. And that's a frustrating situation to be in. So this is a well-known phenomenon since the 50s. It's called motivated reasoning, but it's only in the last couple of years that that notion of motivated reasoning has been studied and really analyzed in the context of social networks and partisan bias, which is, I think, where it's most important today.
It's that word bias that I'm really sort of chewing on right now, because I think being able to own that we have a bias as we thinking human beings who are reacting to the environment and the world that we're in, and that then we should hold that bias with awareness, so that when we're taking in information, we're not automatically shifting through what doesn't fit perfectly, because then we'll never learn or move if we don't.
Yeah, I think that's a huge, and that's my next book is probably going to be dedicated entirely to the topic of bias, because that's sort of where I ended this book, but there's a lot more to say about it.
Okay, pre-orders all around.
Right, well, I have to write it first, but yeah, in the last 5 years, we've had six studies that have done this. And so one was the Democrats and Republicans looking at climate change data, but we've also looked at physicians looking at patients of different race and gender, and discovered like severe implicit bias in decision-making. And we've also found this among like smokers and non-smokers, assessing smoking risks, and even people, just regular folks making like economic judgments about stock prices. You can see bias operating in all these different ways. And there are some like really now through these replicated studies, like well understood network strategies for filtering the conversation in a way that helps to reduce bias across all these different domains. And that's really exciting. But one of the things that's most interesting is that the strategies that are being adopted now, particularly in the context of implicit bias in organizations and in medicine, are strategies that focus on the individual, which is to say, we tell people that they're biased and then expect them to be able to somehow reorient their thinking, despite the fact that they're getting all the same signals they were getting before, right? All the same influences on them. And we expect them individually to be able to sort of overcome that bias. And I think that that's a kind of Sisyphusian task. Which is to say that although you can try and work and be sort of well-intentioned, with all of these other influences surrounding you and shaping your perception of information, it's very hard to step outside all of that, because we are never not social, right? We're never alone in the true way. We speak language, we think linguistically, everything about us is being filtered in this way. And what's, I think, a kind of effective new way of conceptualizing bias is that bias really lives within our social networks, and the influences around us really sort of guide and shape much of how we see the world. And it's very hard to perceive that personally. And this is the case, I think, most conspicuously in the studies we've done with physicians, where it's very hard to look at those cases and say, look, these are racist doctors and nurses. These are well-intentioned doctors and nurses. These are people who are younger, they've gone through medical school, they don't really have the same sorts of biases that people did 50 years ago individually. But collectively within their hospital system, the norms that were there 50 years ago are still being transmitted, which is to say through the learning process of like residents and interns, through the sort of expectations and the ways that patients are treated. And so even the sort of younger, more sophisticated and culturally sensitive physicians that are coming into hospital training are still being kind of enculturated into that way of treating patients. And so the question is, well, how do you stop that? And it's certainly fair to say, yeah, you can tell these people about this bias and see if it works. But all of the studies that have been conducted so far over the last decade that have tried to use these sort of cognitive forcing mechanisms to get physicians to stop treating patients
David, can I jump in
differently.
and just give like a 20 second wrap up? Or can I give you like 20-30 seconds to wrap it up?
Sure.
I'm so sorry. We're running into the time for the next guest speaker.
Sure. The punchline here is that the cognitive forcing mechanisms that people have used in hospitals haven't shown any effect on changing the treatment of patients. And so one of the goals here is to say, can we shift hospital systems at a population level to thinking and talking about patient data differently in a way that debiases the entire hospital network in a way that's effective? And I think that's in many ways my sort of obsession right now with the topic of bias.
Thank you so much. This is such a rich topic that, it could easily fill out the rest of our day here. I do just want to point out that Giovanna shared in the chat up above, we've got copies of books from both of our guest speakers that were donated to the WLS library. So you could jump right into the catalog and find a copy yourself. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming here and contributing and sharing all of your insights. I'm going to pass it right over to Terry so that we can introduce the next guest speaker.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. So Michael F. Shine is a writer, speaker, business owner, and hype artist. He is the author of the Hype Handbook, 12 Indispensable Success Secrets from the World's Greatest Propagandists, Self-Promoters, Cult Leaders, Mischief Makers, and Boundary Breakers, published by McGraw-Hill. Michael's articles have appeared in Fortune, Forbes, Inc., Huffington Post, and Psychology Today. He speaks to international audiences spanning from the northeastern United States to the southeastern coast of China. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael F. Shine.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. I really appreciate that. It's so great to be here. And I'm just going to speak to you guys today like this without slides. It is uniquely fun for me to speak to a group of librarians and book lovers because I'm so often speaking to business audiences and corporate audiences. And it's ironic because I never wanted to own a business. I never wanted to have anything to do with business people. And I'm going to thank you for the comment on the comics, by the way. So I want to talk a little bit about my story and how I came to be an expert on propaganda artists and cult leaders and some of these unsavory characters, and why I believe that it's not only important to learn what we can learn from these people in order to promote good ideas, but that in many ways it's our moral obligation to do so. And I kind of came to that through my own sort of life path. As I said, I never wanted to own a business, be involved in business in any way. I was a book guy. I was a reader very early on. I wanted to write fiction from a very early age, did that for a long time. Then, like so many people of my ilk, got really into music. And on the day that I graduated college, I broke the news to my parents that I was going to move to New York to change rock and roll and start, a band with the ego of youth firmly intact. And I'm I'm not sure I changed rock and roll, but I think we were a little bit more successful than most people in my family really ever thought we would be, particularly because I don't have a very good singing voice and my guitar playing is fairly mediocre. But you know, by the time the band broke up, excuse me, we had a residency at a club called Arlene's Grocery, which is a small but really famous club in New York. You know, the Strokes started out there and some groups like that. We were on TV, we're on the cover of the New York Press. And we completely made that happen by hyping up shows. Now, I had no idea what marketing meant other than, you know, some vague concept, you know, from a class that my parents made me take at school in order to keep paying my tuition. But I was very interested in the idea of hype. You know, there's a concept of hype in the world of hip hop. There's the hype man. There's the idea of the early rock managers who were really good at hyping up their acts. So we learned from these people and would hype up our shows. So, for example, that TV appearance that I talked about, that was actually on Showtime at the Apollo. We appeared on Showtime at the Apollo. Does anyone know that show? Is anyone familiar with that? You can just raise your hand. Well, you know, the audiences on Showtime at the Apollo have a reputation for booing off acts that we don't like. And we knew with 100% certainty that we would be booed off that show, which is why we got ourselves on that show, which led to all kinds of other press attention. I used to dress up as a nun on stage and make sure that press people were there to see that. We used to put up flyers that said Dave Matthews must die, which definitely would not fly now. But as a result, we attracted, you know, pretty big audiences. We had a residency there. So when the band did end up breaking up, I needed a job, and I got a job at a you know, corporate company. And before long, I started to do well there. And, you know, time went by, 8 years went by. I was quite miserable, but I was making a nice living. And I had really kind of lost that mischievous part of me, but I left, and I was going to go become a corporate copywriter, a marketing copywriter. And I figured because I was a good writer, business would just fall in my lap. I had about a year's worth of savings. As it turned out, I almost lost, you know, all of that money. I almost went completely broke, almost went bankrupt because I had no idea how to sell. And I was reading all of the marketing books out there. And I know that a lot of times people, especially in non-business environments, feel a little bit overwhelmed because on one hand, we feel that our work should speak for itself. But on the other hand, with the way that digital technology is going and all of this, we feel that we need to learn this thing called marketing. We need to get on social media, we need to get on Instagram or Clubhouse or what have you. And as a result, we get very overwhelmed. We don't even know where to start. Well, that's where I was at. I read all of the books about social media marketing and search engine optimization and A/B testing and landing pages. And none of it did anything for me. I really, you know, I was just losing more and more money, really struggling. So I was ready to throw in the towel when one day, since I still live in the New York area, I was walking past that club that I used to play at. And I had this breakthrough that, you know, I had sort of lost this benevolently mischievous part of me, and I was trying to market myself. But there were these more fundamental principles of kind of mass psychology, of what gets attention, what gets people emotional. And I was thinking, you know, maybe I have nothing to lose. Maybe I should take a page from my punk rock past and try that approach. So that's exactly what I did. The first thing I did, I wrote an article called Why Gary Vaynerchuk is Flat Out Wrong. Now, this audience, in some audiences that I speak to, everyone knows who Gary Vaynerchuk is. Does anyone here know who he is by any chance? Yeah, it's funny. That's the world of micro celebrity that we live in. You can be a celebrity in one niche and be completely unknown in another. However, he's a very, very big internet guru. And his whole sort of shtick is that he gets up on stage and curses a lot and yells at young entrepreneurs and tells them that they need to hustle all the time. So he says that in order to be successful, they need to work 24/7, tweeting and Instagramming and Snapchatting. He used to say that about 10 years ago that he would wake up at 3 a.m, get on the toilet using much fouler language than that and tweet while he was on the toilet because that's what it takes to become successful. And I disagreed with this. So I wrote an article calling him out very politely And that very night, he recorded a video calling me out by name, telling everybody what an idiot I was. And by the next week, I had my first big corporate client, because it turned out there were a whole lot of people out there who felt like I did, but had no leader to coalesce around. So that was where my obsession began. I began to realize that all of this quote unquote marketing that we're learning, those are the hammers and nails and miter saws. It's important to have good tools. But what people forget is that when attracting attention to ourselves, driving emotion, getting results out of other human beings in the world, there are core fundamental group psychology principles. We are much more alike than we are different. And the previous speaker, alluded to a lot of this as well, which is what makes psychological studies possible. And what I wanted to understand was, if I could look at a swath of the people who did this best throughout history, terrible people like propagandists and cult leaders, but also some of the great social organizers and social activists, managers of bands and hip hop groups. What I wanted to understand were the underlying principles, if you subtracted the specifics of the content, were the underlying principles inherently immoral? Because if they were, I wanted nothing to do with them. And I truly mean that. When I left my corporate job, part of the reason was that I felt I wasn't contributing enough. So I wasn't going to leave that job to become, a con artist. But what I suspected, and what ultimately turned out to be the case, was that the principles that get large numbers of people to move in one way or another, to get carried away, to become transcendent, to take action in large numbers, are neither moral nor immoral, but are amoral. They're just the way things are. And whether we are successful at attracting attention to ourselves and our ventures and getting people to move in the direction we want them to go and buy what we're selling, so to speak, is a function of repurposing those universal psychological principles, to our advantage. So I ultimately started to do that. I systematized my, originally accidental approach. And in fact, it became so successful in building a writing practice that it eventually turned into a marketing agency, which is what I do today. I use these principles to work with organizations and consultants. So, I'm here to talk about a book I wrote about these principles, the Hype Handbook, where I've spent all of this time looking at these various people. And it's been so fascinating because I've learned that there really are 12 universal strategies of what I call hype, which I know has a negative connotation, but I simply define it as any activity or set of activities that gets large numbers of people highly emotional so that they'll take an action that you want them to take. It turns out that whether you're going from the worst cult leaders in the world to the most benign social activists to entrepreneurs who sit right in between, the ones who are good at doing this, they do the same things over and over. You see the same patterns repeat over and over and over again, and it is reverse engineerable. And so what I want to talk today, because there are 12 strategies, but because of this group, I want to focus on one of the 12 strategies and really spend time in that, because I think it's the most applicable to this group, and the kinds of people that I know are here. And then at the end, before we do questions and answers, I want to talk to you a little bit about why I think it is so important to open your mind to hype, really. So, of all the strategies that are in the book, I mean, some of the names are make war, not love, create, perfect your packaging, give the little babies their milk, become a trickster. The one I want to focus on is one called create your own secret society. And I sometimes call it the piggybacking principle. And to sort of introduce this to you, I want to tell you a story about one of my favorite hype artists. I'm not sure I'd like to have a beer with him, but he's certainly fascinating. And his name is Edward Bernays. Has anyone here heard of Edward Bernays? You might have seen him in the Adam Curtis documentary, Century of the Self. Yeah, so Time magazine actually once called Edward Bernays the single most influential 20th century American who no one knows about. He is responsible for it being acceptable for women to smoke. Before him, it was considered an extreme taboo, before the 1920s for women to smoke. And he created a seemingly spontaneous march for liberty, torches for liberty, where suffragettes lit up cigarettes to show that they were, feminist. And it was on behalf of Lucky Strike. He had a South American country, Guatemala, actually overthrown on behalf of the United Fruit Company. And he is the human being responsible for Americans eating bacon for breakfast. Now, and someone made a comment, he's referred to as the father of public relations. That's very true. And another piece of trivia, he invented the term public relations because he originally called it propaganda, and he has a book called Propaganda. But after the World Wars, that term went out of vogue, so he changed it to public relations. So if you know any PR people, this is kind of something interesting to hold over their heads. So Edward Bernays was hired by Beechnut, which was a major pork producer in the United States at the time, and they wanted to up bacon consumption. Excuse me. And at the time, Americans didn't really eat a lot of bacon, for breakfast. I did a talk in China and I asked the audience, what do you guys think of as the quintessential American breakfast? And all of these people said bacon and eggs. And this was simply not the case before Edward Bernays. So Edward Bernays had always cultivated an extremely powerful network of highly placed individuals using dubious methods. But there you had it. And one of them was this physician who was himself connected to about 5,000 other physicians across the country. He was a major, expert in his field, highly perceived expert, conducted studies. And Edward Bernays got this gentleman to create a study that the result of the study was that bacon is the perfect breakfast food from a health perspective because it replaces the energy that you lose during sleep. So I have to say, I saw a study that said that drinking 25 cups of coffee is good for you. And my first gut reaction was, oh, that's awesome. That's only 5 off from what I'm already doing. But I don't know. With all due respect to the academics among us, I've always doubted the validity of studies after this research. In any case, this study was mailed to 5,000 doctors across the country who accepted it. And before long, every doctor in America was recommending that their patients eat bacon for breakfast. And, the eating habits of a country were transformed. So, is the moral of this story that you should pay off highly placed individuals and get them to fabricate studies, to further your commercial ends? Absolutely. No, it is not. The moral of this story is that what great hype artists do is that they make it seem like the bulk of the spread of their ideas is coming from a grassroots level. That people are just so into their ideas, kind of, what we heard in the talk before, that, one person likes a product so much that they recommend it to another person, and that person recommends it to 2 people, and it just sort of diffuses through the culture because it's so wonderful. That's a more romantic version of how something spreads. But what the best hype artists do is, while they're doing some activities to get things to spread on the surface, they're creating a group of people unseen that I call a secret society. Well-placed individuals who have their own followings, who have their own networks, who can, write a word or two, say a word or two, and get thousands of people to see whatever it is that they're trying to build an audience for. And this all happens under the surface. And then it seems like it's happening from a grassroots level. So how does this help us? Well, a lot of us are really reluctant or uncomfortable, as I said before, with the idea of going on social media and just talking about how great we are all the time and talking about our ventures and talking about our library programs, talking about our initiatives, whatever they are. And, honestly, there's good reason to be uncomfortable with that because it usually doesn't work. A lot of times the gurus who are out there preaching, social media marketing, social media spread, influencing, influencers, TikTok, whatever the newest thing is, they have a lot to gain by doing that. They're helping cement their own image as someone who is so talented at spreading the word about what they're selling that there can't help but be this viral spread for what they do. But if you really dig in and watch what they actually do versus what they say they do, they spend a lot more time creating this extremely close group of people, friends, who will do favors for them, who will spread the word for them. And this goes beyond networking, going to networking events and sharing your business card and things like that. There's a gentleman named, gentleman might not be the right word for him, a guy named Tucker Max, who made his name writing this. He wrote this book called I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell. It was a pretty sexist book. It was about how he went to bars and picked up women and got drunk all the time. And it sold millions and millions of copies. But as this guy got older, he had a family and he wanted to change his image and he wanted to do something else. So he came up with this idea for a company called Book in a Box, where he basically set up structures for ghostwriting books with underemployed ghostwriters. And, he didn't want to spend another 10 years building up a following for this person by person because his following was very strong, but it was fraternity brothers and people like that. It was completely a different audience than who he wanted to sell to. However, over the years, he had built this group of associations with people like Ryan Holiday, who's a best-selling author and promoter in his own right, James Altucher, similarly, Tucker Max. They all have very, very popular podcasts and blogs. And when he created his company, he said to them all, hey, listen, in a 1 to 2 month period, can I get on all of your shows and can you sing this new business's praises? And that's exactly what he did. And the business did about $1 million in revenue in the first month. We often hear it's who you know. People say that they're struggling to get traction around whatever venture they're involved with promoting because they don't know enough people. And that's true. That's the bad news. The good news is that anyone can get to know the right people. And it's better if you're very selective about that group. You don't want a broad network. That's useful. But what you want is a core, a group of people, a little secret society behind the scenes. So how do you do that? How do you make that happen? And I want to, talk through some hard and fast tactics. And this can be used for, anything from getting public approval behind an initiative that you want to happen in your community, to getting people to pay attention to a program that you're running, to selling your products and services as we normally talk about. But, and again, we use modern technology as the tool to further the architecture of human nature and group psychology. So social media. What many of us do with social media is we go on and when we have an event or something like that, we tweet it out or we put an Instagram thing with a hashtag and we hope people will find it, or we try to build followers. But we often forget the social component. Imagine if you were to use social media to gain access to and connect with people that you normally would have no opportunity to do so with, either because of their quote unquote status or because of geographical diversity or what have you. This tool could give you access to connect with them on a very human level and form a bond. So, in the 70s, when David Bowie was at the height of his fame, when he was doing the Ziggy Stardust thing, there was a journalist who wanted to get an interview with him, and he was a beginning journalist, a journalist starting out, and it was very difficult for anyone to get access to Bowie unless, you know, he granted you access. And this guy worked for a small magazine, like Musician Magazine. So he had an idea. He looked at Bowie's liner notes, and he noticed that on every David Bowie album, the saxophone player was David Bowie. And that was really weird because David Bowie didn't play instruments. Sometimes he would strum a guitar, but he always had these great bands behind him. So saxophone, you never saw him on stage playing saxophone. What was that all about? So he had a thought. He called up Bowie's people and he said, I'd like to interview, you know, Mr. Bowie, and they were ready to hang up on him. And he said, about his sax playing. And there was a pause, and they said, give us a second. And they put Bowie on the line, and David Bowie granted this interview. It turns out that David Bowie's the thing that got him into music was the saxophone. He used to listen to Little Richard records, and there's sax playing all over those records. So that was the first instrument he played. He loved the saxophone. And no one ever asked him about it. They asked him about, you know, his costumes, his songs, his sexuality, and all of these things. But no one ever asked him about his sax playing. So this journalist got the interview, and it became this legendary, you know, piece of rock journalism that launched this guy's career. So a lot of times when we try to form relationships with people who can help our initiatives or help our ventures, what we do is we hit them up the way everyone else is. We either say to them, hey, you know, can I pick your brain? I'm such a big admirer of your, you know, insert the same thing everyone else is talking about from a professional level, or we ask them for something, or we offer to make introductions to them. But these people are being asked, the more influential people are, the more they're being hit up every day of the week about, you know, to get help, to get advice, to all of these things. And they have to put blinders up. They feel like they're being sold, even if that isn't your, you know, aim. Their cortisol levels go up. They put guards up. But everyone is a human being first. If you can, I call this benevolent stalking. If there's someone you really want to meet who could really help, you know, this secret society of yours spread the word about what you're doing, stalk them for a while. Pay attention. Don't just tweet at them. Look at them on Twitter. Look at them on Instagram. They'll put a lot of business stuff up there. But once in a great while, they'll say something human. Could be about a book they like that's not a business book or that's not in their field. Could be about a band, a sports team, a hobby. There's a gentleman in my field named Brian Clark, and he wrote this. He has a company called Copy Blogger, and it's like the biggest content marketing media company around. And I would look at his tweets, and he would constantly be tweeting helpful information. And then once in a while, he'd mention an obscure like 80s punk band, and I would be like, well, that's weird, you know, that's not usual. And then I found out that he was booking Henry Rollins at his copywriting conference. And I thought that was really weird because Henry Rollins is, you know, was the singer of Black Flag. So I tweeted something about that to him, about some band that he mentioned. And he answered me and he's like, oh, you like that band? Now we were dealing as two human beings, two equals. Then what you want to do is a really good approach for using technology is create a piece of digital content the goal of which is not to gain a huge audience, but is to gain access to these highly placed power players. So imagine if you created a podcast. When most people start podcasts, what they do is they think about, you know, how many people are going to listen to this podcast or blog? How can I get sponsors? How can I get 100,000 followers a month? And, you know, there are 700,000 podcasts in the United States by last count, because they're very easy to make compared to a television show or something like that. And the vast majority of them are abandoned very quickly. Most of them have very few listeners. But imagine if you use that podcast as positive bait. if there was a person out there that you connected with for strategic reasons, you say, listen, you're such an interesting person. I'd love to have you on my podcast and interview you. Now you have an excuse to have an in-depth conversation with somebody who wants to talk about themselves. And you can get on the line with this person and interview this person and really, really dig into what their passions are, what their interests are, give them exposure, stroke their ego a little bit, because we all like that. Put something out with their name on it. And then afterwards, treat them like you would a friend. Do favors for them, make introductions for them, and it'll go, a long way. Another, tactic for this particular strategy is something I call the top 20 approach. Now, again, a lot of this sounds very tactical and Machiavellian, but the thing is, it's very important to believe in everything that you're saying. So if you are positively stalking somebody and you're not actually interested in what they have to say, that is not someone you should start a conversation with. If you ask to interview somebody and it's not someone you really want to interview, please do not interview them. And the next tactic is very similar to that. So when my book came out, I knew that being on a lot of podcasts was one of the most effective ways to get people to buy the books. We're in a pandemic. It's hard to tour bookshops. Plus, podcasts are listened to by very dedicated listeners, especially if they're on the topic, at large, the relevant topic. So I didn't know how to get on podcasts. So what I did is I made a list of all of the best podcasters that I really liked that were either in the social psychology space or the marketing space. And I wrote an email to them, but I had to really like them. And I wrote an email to them because I write a column for Psychology Today. And I said, hey, listen, I'm doing an article in Psychology Today of the top 20, psychology podcasters for business people. You're on my short list. And they all were. And then I said, oh, by the way, I've got this new book. I'd be curious if you'd, take a look at it and see if you think it'd be good for your show. I booked myself on 50 podcasts in no time. And everybody won. The podcasters got their name in Psychology Today, which helped them grow their audiences. I got on a whole lot of podcasts. I even got some clients out of those people. And I admitted to, it's funny, the people who hired me were the ones who I said to afterwards, hey, that thing that you want to make happen, that's what I did to you. And they all laughed and said, I want some of that magic. So the point here is that you want to be constantly seeing the world through people's eyes and building a core of people where there's a mutual reinforcement underneath the surface. So the next time you have a big event, the next time you have a program, the next time you have, to raise money, fundraising, instead of going out to LinkedIn and scrambling at the last minute and ringing, pulling your hair out because you don't know the right people to make that happen, or you don't have a big enough email list, or you don't have a big enough following, you now have a few well-placed phone calls that you can make, a few human pressure points that you can press to execute this hype engine very, very quickly and create a cascading effect for your ventures. So, there are a lot of strategies like this, and we can spend a lot of time talking about it in the Q&A, and they're all, obviously in the book. But I want to make a point, about why it's so important to figure out the true mechanics of how ideas spread, how ventures really get support, how things are really sold, how crowds become energetic around products and ideas and services and programs. I can only imagine that this audience has similar political leanings to me. If you don't, forgive me, I am who I am. But I have this habit of reading very obscure crowd psychology books and things like that. And there's one called The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon. It was written in 1895. Gustave Le Bon, he watched as the Paris Commune burned Paris to the ground. And in the beginning, they had reasons for doing what they were doing. By the end, it was just a crazy mob lighting fires to buildings with no strategic importance. And this really upset him. It changed the course of his life. And he gave up his medical practice and he became the first crowd psychologist. He began to study why crowds behave the way they do, why people behave differently in groups as they do as individuals. And he wrote this book. It's a slim book, but every word really describes why crowds behave, usually in irrational ways. So it was one of the first political debates, and I was on a business trip, and I was just like laying on top of the duvet, flipping around the way I do through this book and watching the first debate. And this was when Trump was essentially considered, there was no chance he could win. He was considered a joke candidate. I think it was when there were 17 Republicans in the race. And I was watching Trump talk and I was reading this book, and the book said things like, crowds respond to external signifiers of prestige. When there is no prestige, money is an excellent substitute. Crowds respond to vague future-focused language that you can put your own meaning into and firm commands. So I was reading this and I was watching the debate, and I remember coming home and saying to my, artsy left-leaning friends, this guy's gonna win. And people made fun of me. They were like, there's no way. And we all know what happened. So the thing is, again, I'll just come out and say it. I don't like Trump. I think he's bad for society. And there are people even worse than him. The people who are narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, they get this stuff. And it's not because the stuff's immoral. It's because if you're a sociopath, if you fall in the antisocial personality disorder spectrum, they've done experiments, lab experiments with these people. When they put them in socially stressful situations, their heart rate doesn't go up. And what that means is that people with antisocial personality disorder, that family of disorders, they can see other human beings as players on a chessboard. So it's not to say that the strategies themselves are in any way evil. It's that they don't let emotions get in the way. Now, their aims are often malicious, but they're able to really detach themselves and say, this is exactly the way the world works, and I know what I need to do to get the result I want, often to disastrous ends. The rest of us, on the other hand, we let the emotions get in the way. I mean, if I could execute every strategy in this book perfectly, I would be worth a lot more money than I am today, because I get nervous. I second guess myself. I, don't speak as confidently as I could. And most of us do that. So really my goal with this book, and in a lot of the work I do, and in speaking to groups like this, is to make the case to the good guys out there, to people, behind library programs, for example, which are just so important to me and to a functioning society, that understanding group psychology and how to get people emotionally engaged around your good ideas is valid to do if it's done for the right reason, and to put these tools in the hands of the good guys, because the bad guys already get it, whether we like it or not. And we need more really good people with good products, good causes, good ideas, good art, using hype to positive ends. So that's where I will end, and I would love to open this up to a question and answer.
Thank you. Once again, everybody, feel free. Oh, Allison, we've got already a hand up.
Jumping on it because I seem to wait too long. First of all, just a comment of appreciation. This is really interesting, and I appreciate how accessible you seem to have made everything. For people like me, this is not my area of expertise, and I can really see the positive application that it could have, especially like I'm a public librarian on public libraries, and getting to groups of people that we have a hard time reaching. We understand the value of the social word of mouth type sharing of information, but even getting to that first person to get that word of mouth out can be a real challenge. So that's my comment. And then the question I have is that you mentioned a bunch of different ways of reaching out to people: social media, Twitter, phone calls, email. Do you find the message and the connection to be more important than the mode of communication, or does that, does how you reach out to people affect the interaction at all, or do you have anything to say?
Great question, because I think especially in my world, you'll often hear things like, I'll talk to people who are in companies and they'll say, we're really getting serious about our marketing. We just bought HubSpot. Now, HubSpot is a marketing automation tool. It's just a piece of software. But people have the feeling that if they buy HubSpot, it's going to transform their fortunes. And it never does. So, the cathedrals were built with hammers that look like a rock on a stick, and now we have much better tools, and the tools make things faster and they make things easier. It's a lot quicker to build buildings now than it used to be. But the principles of architecture and engineering and beauty are the same. The Emperor Augustus commissioned the Aeneid as propaganda. It's a classic of history, but he needed to legitimize his rule because he was a dictator who overthrew the Republic, right? So yeah, I think what you want to do is, instead of starting with the technology like we usually do, right? A lot of people say, oh man, now there's Clubhouse. I really need to get on this. I had just mastered Twitter, right? Which one should I do? And should I use mail or should I use email, or are people not using email? And should I have a blog? I think I should have a blog. Everyone has a blog. Instead of doing that, think to yourself, or at least focus first on, okay, let me try to see the world through other human beings' eyes. And sometimes you can't really see the world through other people's eyes unless you study the science behind it. But that's a good starting place, and say, how would I respond if I was, say, I don't know, asked to do an interview about my favorite hobbies on a podcast, right? Or on a blog, or on paper, or on 2 peach boxes in Piccadilly Circus, you know what I mean? Whatever. So in other words, you first want to start with, how do human beings behave in groups and one-on-one? Where do human beings view reality incorrectly? Like biases are a good example of that. We're evolved not to see the world correctly. We're evolved to see it in a way that'll help us, survive and spread our genes. So when you use language, what language do you use to get people to respond in a way that clicks with this faulty human brain? And once you figure all that out, okay, how do I do that the most quickly and reach the most people? And usually it is digital, because digital is quicker. But then again, let's say everyone's overwhelmed with email, and you mail someone a really beautiful package in the mail. That might be your strategy. Yeah, it just depends.
Yeah. I was actually thinking, wow, that's really effective. I tend to think more of I'm not just going to send someone a message on Messenger. I'd rather have a conversation with them. But that you're thinking about too, like, people are really busy, so maybe for some people that would be the best way. So it's really interesting to kind of think a little bit outside the box of maybe formal methods of reaching out. So thank you, appreciate that.
I see some question. So do I think Trump is a sociopath? Yeah, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know what he is. I know he's manipulative, and I know that what I know as an amateur about, there from what I understand, just from my readings on psychology, is there are kind of baskets of psychological disorders. There are like neuroses, which is like anxiety and depression and things like that, neurotic disorders. And then there are antisocial personality disorders, which are like psychopathy and sociopathy and extreme narcissism. If I had to guess, I feel like he falls in that basket, because he's a guy, he talks about loyalty, and then he is completely unloyal. He doesn't pay his vendors. These are things that most of us wouldn't do, because we feel empathy and we feel emotion and we feel that would hurt somebody and that we would be breaking the rules. And he doesn't seem to be constrained by those things. So those are my guesses.
I asked, just as a point, I'm the one who asked the question, and I do have training to diagnose a person clinically. but therefore I am not allowed to do it for a
Yeah.
stranger. But one comment you said just threw me, where you said they don't let emotions get in the way. And I'm not sure they have the emotions that get in the way.
Right.
I'm not sure that, you know, I don't know that they feel anything when other people suffer, where the rest of us, when we see human suffering, feel bad. I don't know that they do. I don't know that they can be happy for other people.
That's it. That's the
So,
point. So my point being is you don't want to become an animal like that. You know, you don't want to become, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if someone is effective at something, you can look at the parts that work and use those parts in a way that
That's
fits. You know, Napoleon killed a lot of people, but he was also one of the best strategists that ever lived. Now, should a person ignore his strategy because he used it in service of conquest? I don't know. You know, that's what I'm saying. We're never going to eliminate our emotion, which is why we can't become that, nor would we want to. What I'm saying is it's worth studying them and seeing the pieces that work and then trying to apply them in an ethical way. Does that make, I mean, does that resonate with
no,
your
it totally
Yeah.
makes sense.
But I
It
don't think they
totally
do.
makes
I don't
sense.
think they feel that the same. I don't think they perceive the world the way we perceive the world. I think that's true.
So I see
Thank you.
Anthony has a question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask Michael a question. We were talking about kind of increase of digital marketing and digital communication. Do you think that in sort of a post-pandemic world where now we're kind of restricting our in-person interactions and communications, and just generally we're using digital mediums just to reach more people, that it's going to sort of devalue the personal kind of human connections we used to have when we were either marketing or trying to do an event, things of that nature? Do you ever think of like the psychological aspects of us not having that more intimate interactions that we used to have to?
You know, it's a good question. I mean, I can't predict the future. However, I will say this. Well, two things. One thing is that I think the human brain evolves a lot more slowly than the technology that we create. So what I found in my research, which I think was probably the most interesting thing I found, is how if you strip away the content, the way people respond is just so consistent over time. So like when but the technology amplifies the spread, right? So like, you know, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of a church and started the Protestant Reformation, and we think of that as a largely positive thing, but nothing, the amount of slaughter from religious warfare after that, and really intense mob mentality stuff that happened as a result of that was crazy. But there had been people like Martin Luther before him, but there was no printing press, so they were just burned at the stake and no one heard about it. But when Martin Luther created his 95 Theses, it was disseminated. So as a result, instead of one town having this disruption, all of Europe had the disruption. And there were these communities, these Anabaptist communities, where they walled themselves in and starved themselves for 30 days and had mass marriages and all this stuff. So now we're seeing all of this craziness with social media and QAnon and this and that. I wonder, is it because I don't feel like human interaction is devalued or anything like that? I just feel that the technology is accelerating the dynamics that are already in place. So I mean, there used to be that movie Demolition Man, or that was that stupid movie Demolition Man, where like the woman says to the guy like, hey, do you want to like sleep with me? And he's all excited, and they use these like headsets, you know, he's like, what is this? Right? Like, I don't see that happening. You could have all the headsets in the world and people are still going to get together in a room, right? I think human beings are human beings, but I think that the technology really increases the spread and scale and the way that our in-wired traits are accelerated and triggered.
Okay, I think we'll just ask one more question and then we'll continue on with the agenda. So Michael, okay, in terms of determining a successful marketing effort, library boards often want to know how many people we were able to reach, but in reality, success is probably best defined by the positive impact that we're generating. Unfortunately, few people like to complete follow-up surveys and things like that. How do you express the impact of the positive impact of marketing, of hype, especially when it can be tough to kind of quantify those things?
I know it's probably hard when government dollars are involved, because governments have a lot of great things about them, but they're also bureaucratic and rule-based. But I can tell you from my world what we do, and maybe you can adapt it. We have a term in the marketing agency world called vanity metrics. And what that basically means are metrics, indicators of success that really don't mean anything, but they sound good. Like, so a good example is number of Twitter followers. Like, that can be useful if you're trying to get advertisement for a YouTube channel. But if you're like, I'll talk to these people, and I say this to them. I'll have a client, they'll say, we really want to increase our social media following. And I'll say, okay, what do you sell? I sell business to business software. How much does it cost? $100,000. How many deals do you need this year to have a great year? 7. So why do you need 1 million social media followers? Do those people have money? Do you need 100 CEOs who follow your stuff? So what I do to get around this, because we have a version of it, is I ask questions. So I'll sit in a room with a new client and I'll say, listen, if a year goes by and we're sitting down together and you say to me, Mike, what a year. This was the best year I could have possibly imagined. I mean, professionally, even personally, because they're connected, it couldn't have gone better. For you to be able to tell me that, what will have needed to happen? And then they talk and I write it down. So they'll say, oh, we needed to get 5 new Fortune 500 clients. We needed to get blah, 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 blah. So then when we're working together and they say to me something, I don't see any Twitter follower growth. I say, well, hold on, let's have a conversation, because you said that success meant 5 new, clients, and we got you 3. What do you want to change what success means? In other words, I think it's really important, if you can do this politically without harming yourself in a very rule-based environment, to get people to define what success really means and hold them to it in a polite way. How possible is that? I don't know. It takes some courage, but otherwise, I think you waste a lot of time measuring and driving the wrong things.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thanks everyone for the questions.
This was a great group. Thank you.
This is, so much food for thought. It's definitely making the professional development planning easier and easier in terms of figuring out some future workshops and discussions. So
that makes me happy.
Thank you so much. Okay, and then jumping right into professional development, I'm going to pass it over to my professional development co-chair, Megan Fenton, and we're going to announce the PD Awards.
You ready, Krishna?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Each year, the Westchester Library Association awards up to 2 $500 scholarships. This award is designed to assist WLA members pursuing professional development activities and courses that will contribute to or enhance the performance in their library career. We have 2 winners this year, and I'm going to announce the first one. Krishna will announce our second one. Our first winner this year is Jessica Netto. Jessica is the head clerk in the circulation department at the Tuckahoe Public Library, where she also assists with program planning as well as story time and book displays for children. She is currently pursuing her Master's of Library and Information Science at the University of Buffalo. Jessica will be using the WLA Professional Development Award towards a course on emerging technologies in pursuit of finishing her master's degree. Congratulations, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm trying to find a way to, there's my my applause button. Okay. Thank you, Megan. So I'll announce the second winner. Kenji Kaneshiro is a library assistant with the Harrison Public Library, where in addition to daily public service and cataloging duties, Kenji also manages the library's 3D printers, organizes the juried art program, assembles the monthly newsletter, and is responsible for the library's social media platforms. Kenji spends lots of time educating the public on the use of technology in and outside of the library, which brings great joy. And Kenji will be using the WLA Professional Development Award to attend the annual NYLA conference, where he will also participate as a speaker on the panel, Inspiring New Voices in Libraries. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so in addition to that, I just want to point out that we will be sending, I know we just maybe 5 minutes ago mentioned how hard it is to get feedback on surveys. Well, after today, we will be sending out a feedback survey for the annual conference. We love any feedback we can get from you, from anyone who participated. And to sweeten the deal a little bit, we have extra copies of the books, 3 extra copies of each book from the guest speakers, and those will be going out to a random person who fills out the survey before the 18th of May. So surveys will be going out after the meeting. Thank you, everyone, for participating today. I'm going to push it over now to, I believe Kim is going to take over for the closing remarks. Is Kim connected? I know she was having some, there were some internet issues.
I did see Kim. She should
There we
be.
go.
There she
No,
is.
I moved from where I was because the air conditioner started in, so. Okay, congratulations to our winners. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Kim Stucco, the incoming president of the Westchester Library Association, soon to be known as the Roundtable of NYLA. That's the New York Library Association. As a group, we are entering another year of change. WLA will be joining NYLA as a roundtable, and we're working to reestablish our nonprofit status, as well as continuing to expand our great professional development opportunities. Also, during this year, our members will be trying to bring their individual libraries back to pre-COVID hours and staffing. No small feat, but I know as a group we will make it. I would like to begin by thanking the outgoing and incoming board members who have helped make this day a resounding success. Many of their voices were heard today introducing our panelists and speakers. A big round of applause for everyone who helped put this day together. A thank you to all of our local and state officials who were kind enough to take time out of their busy schedule to keep us informed about library matters. Thank you to Barbara Fisher for her poetry. A big hug and high five to the library professionals who participated in our panel. I was inspired by the panel and the stories of their journeys in our chosen profession. Since our profession is filled with such varied job titles and job descriptions, WLA will be continuing this type of panel discussion, bringing together a diverse group of library professionals to discuss their individual journeys. It is always good to be introduced to fellow professionals who are excelling in their field. Thank you to Elena for her breath, body, and mind exercise, something I know we all need and will make use of now and in the future. Thank you to both Damon Santella and Michael Shine for their wonderful presentations. I know I will be reading Michael's current book and finding more secret successes from the world's greatest propagandists, self-promoters, cult leaders, mischief makers, and boundary breakers. I know there are several of them already in our audience, and I hope to read about them in his next book, hint, hint. Thank you to our sponsors, Westchester Library System, Waldo, the Village Bookstore, EBSCO, Green Business Partnership, Office Dynamics, Simply Phone, and Westchester Parodontics. As we proceed into our new year and a new normal, may we stay connected and take advantage of any and all opportunities that are presented to us to meet each other, exchange ideas, and explore our profession. On that note, and a little self-promotion, we will be continuing the mostly monthly meet and unwinds. If you are interested in joining us, the next one will be in June. Here we gather as a group via Zoom to discuss a variety of topics and exchange professional ideas. All are invited to attend. You can check our website, www.westchesterlibraryassociation.org, for the specific date. Also, look in your inbox early next week because you will be receiving a survey about today. Please take a few minutes to complete it by. On that day, we will be drawing 3 names and sending them a copy of both books by our keynote speakers. Again, I cannot say how thankful I am for all of our members and future members. And I know one day soon we will be able to meet in person to share a drink or dinner or dance or a high five or favorite yoga pose while still wearing a mask, of course. Thank you for coming, and I hope to meet every one of you over the next 12 months.
Thank you so much, Kim.
You're welcome.
You said it all, so I don't have much to add. I just wanted to share my screen quickly, just to show you again the sponsors who we, oh, that didn't work out the way I wanted to. You're gonna have to see the whole thing. We're especially grateful to the Westchester Library System and Waldo, at all of our sponsors, but especially to WLS and Waldo for their extremely generous donation towards the conference and the book donations, which, because of their sponsorship, we were able to provide to many of the all of the Westchester Library System public libraries and several colleges in the area. And I wanted to just reemphasize again our board members, and this is at a glance all the people that are involved. A total of 26, including all the executive board members. And I just wanted to mention, we do have a new chair for our future conferences, and that's Renee Rausch. And since Kathy Polovic will be stepping in as our vice president-elect, we will be looking for a new chair of the legislative committee. So if you are interested, please let Kim know, and we'd be happy to have you join us. And thank you for all the kind words in the chat. And the survey will be going out to you soon. So keep an eye out for it, and we will put your name in the raffle for the 3 copies. We have 3 copies of each book. So 6 winners.
If you need to get in touch with us, there is a form on the Westchester Library Association website. So you can put your name and any kind of comments you would like in there also.
Yes, and we made it before 3 o'clock, so you get 10 minutes extra. So thank you to all of you who stayed from the very beginning this morning at 8:30 when we opened the meet and greet room. And I know I'm going to forget people, but just looking out across my screen, the faces I see, Kim Stucco, who was also co-chair of this conference. So kudos to you, Kim. To Krishna, who was our captain and host for the day. Wonderful job. To Megan, and also again to Krishna for the professional development programs they put on throughout the year, which was not an easy thing to do, especially with everything else that was happening, and for handling the professional development awards as well. Melissa Victoria on our conference committee, Kathleen Polovic was able to get so many legislators to speak with us today. And our past presidents who are here today, Diana Lennon, Elaine Provenzano, and Liz Anastasi, and Sarah Bramble. And I hope I didn't miss anyone. I know James Trapassa was here earlier as well. So just thank you. Keep up the good work. Stay with us as we transition to NILA. It's a work in progress, but I think step in the right direction. So if you have any concerns, comments, questions, reach out to us. We'd be happy to hear from you. And on that note, I think we're done for the day. You're welcome to stay on if you just want to say hi to one another. You can unmute yourselves and go wild. Have a great weekend, everyone, and happy Mother's Day to all the moms there that are here. Godmothers, all different variations of mothers. Happy Mother's Day. And I guess most importantly, I want to say stay safe and be well.